Coming up next, Rancid Octi. Coming up next, Human Madeline. Coming up next, Rancid Rabbit. Coming up next, Human Kimberly. Coming up next, Rancid Fredo. Coming up next, Human Melvin. Coming up next, The Marvelous Misadventures of Fredo. Coming up next, Camp Melvin. Coming up next, The Marvelous Misadventures of Victor and Valentino. Coming up next, Camp Candy. Coming up next, The Marvelous Misadventures of Victor and Valentino. Coming up next, Camp Candy. Coming up next, The Marvelous Misadventures of Manny Rivera. Coming up next, Camp. Coming up next, Andy. Coming up next, Diana. Coming up next, Adam. Coming up next, Lorne. Coming up next, Bob's Burgers. Coming up next, Futurama. Coming up next, Sanjay. Coming up next, Dendi. Coming up next, Wendy. Coming up next, Nancy. Coming up next, Harvey. Coming up next, Harley. Coming up next, Steve. Coming up next, Gus. Coming up next, Gomez. Coming up next, Carrie. Coming up next, Steven Rules. Coming up next, Gardenia. Coming up next, my gym partner's a monkey. Coming up next, Foster's Home. Coming up next, Rocket Monkeys. Coming up next, Scaredy Squirrel. Coming up next, Tough Puppy. Coming up next, Samurai Jack. Coming up next, Rocket Power. Coming up next, As Told by Ginger. Coming up next, Richie Rich. Coming up next, Chevron. Coming up next, The Mighty Bee. Coming up next, My Life as a Teenage Robot. Coming up next, My Gym Partner's a Monkey. Coming up next, Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Coming up next, Chuck's Choice. Coming up next, Alice and Lewis.